This paper has had a variety of titles. Monetary Policy, the International Dimension. The title before this one was, Does the Fed Care About the World? And our conveners suggested to me that that was perhaps open to misinterpretation and might be best modified slightly, as it has been. My task has been eased by some of the comments made in the previous session, by Carmen's reminder that the United States is an open economy. That's also the point of my paper. The argument of the paper is that, in fact, open economy considerations have repeatedly played a consequential role in the conduct of Federal Reserve policy, a statement that I think might come as a bit of a shock to the presumptions of many people in this room. They're accustomed to thinking about Fed policy in terms of the institution's dual mandate, which refers to price stability and maximum employment, but not to the exchange rate or other international economic and financial variables. People will be used to viewing Fed policy through the lens of the Taylor rule, in which the exchange rate and other international variables matter only insofar as they influence inflation and the output gap, which is to say, by and large, not very much. I will argue that this view of the conventional state of affairs is too heavily, in fact, shaped by the distinctive and peculiar circumstances of the last 3 decades, when the influence of international considerations on Fed policy has, in fact, been limited. International considerations repeatedly played a larger role in earlier phases of the institution's history. I think this longer perspective is a reminder that just because the Fed has not attached priority to international aspects of monetary policy in the recent past is no guarantee that it won't do so in the future. The founding of the Fed, to start at the start, is typically portrayed in terms of domestic financial stability considerations. Interest rates spike during the harvest and planting seasons, giving rise to financial stringency and instability. The Fed was therefore created, quote, to furnish an elastic currency and for other purposes. My point then being that the for other purposes part is important. In addition to those desiring a more elastic currency, there were exporters, importers, and financial interests who wanted to establish a market in dollar-denominated trade credits and more generally create an international role for the dollar. Before World War I, they were aware the dollar in New York played little role in financing international trade. Even the trade of U.S. importers and exporters themselves, taking payment in dollars was unattractive given the volatility of American financial markets, because U.S. banks were prohibited from branching abroad. Converting dollar payments back into local currency was not straightforward. That left the New York financial community unable to compete with London for an important source of business. It put U.S. importers and exporters at a competitive disadvantage. Therefore, the Federal Reserve Act authorized U.S. banks to branch abroad for the first time so that they could originate international business, and one of the first initiatives of the new central bank was to take steps to foster a market in trade credits, known in contemporary parlance as trade acceptances. The challenge with creating a new market, of course, is developing liquidity. Without a minimum level of transactions, the market will lack liquidity. If it lacks liquidity, there won't be the requisite willingness to transact. That was the chicken and egg problem facing the new central bank, and it responded by stepping in as the buyer and liquidity provider of last resort, purchasing dollar acceptances at or close to the prevailing price when private demand was lacking. And at the outset, private demand was always lacking. So in the 1920s, the Fed was the principal counterparty in this market. It was the dominant purchaser of trade-related paper. If you want to put it this way, credit easing or large-scale asset purchases are not entirely unprecedented in the history of the institution. And those efforts in the 1920s succeeded in the sense that New York and the dollar quickly came to match and surpass London and sterling as a source for credit for global trade, a very startling change from the situation prior to 1914. The other thing the Fed did, the New York Fed in particular did under Benjamin Strong in the 1920s, was to cut its discount rate in 1924 and engage in those expansionary open market operations in 1927 that Julio referred to. I have its discount rate here, where the 24-25 cuts are visible, what it did in 27 less so. Those cuts were taken with the goal of helping Great Britain back on the gold standard. So Strong saw exchange rate instability as having a withering effect, his words, on international trade, and international trade as the key to U.S. prosperity. His policy was criticized at the time, as we heard in the last session, as inappropriately loose for domestic circumstances. It was criticized specifically for fueling the real estate and Wall Street bubbles of the 1920s, both of which, of course, came down with a crash. His critics concluded it would have been better for him to, for the Fed to keep its eye on the domestic ball. That's a normative judgment. The positive statement is that international considerations were quite important at critical junctures in the 1920s for shaping Federal Reserve policy. The next time they were critically important was, of course, in 1931, in October of 1931, following Britain's departure from gold. In response, the Fed made unmistakably clear where its priorities lay. This was in the teeth of the Great Depression, and it responded to the international dimension, the external repercussions of Britain's departure from gold, by raising the discount rate by 200 basis points. That made speculating against the dollar more costly. Again, the wisdom of the decision has been questioned by Friedman and Schwartz and others, but it's clear that the Fed privileged exchange rate stability over price stability, over financial stability, and over economic stability. The final attack on the dollar, of course, occurred in March of 1933, worries that FDR might devalue and encourage capital flight. Their nationwide banking panic resulted. At that point, there was essentially no choice but to embargo gold exports, close the banks, and regroup. That then was the initial step down the path that brought to a close the first era in which international considerations played a prominent role in U.S. monetary policy. After the dollar was stabilized once again against gold in January of 1934, it's hard to find much of a trace of international factors on Fed decision-making. Devaluation had enhanced the country's international competitiveness. With the approach of World War II, there were large capital flows toward the United States, with the problem now not gold and capital outflows, as before 1933, but large gold and capital inflows. U.S. policy was essentially unconstrained by international factors. Then comes World War II and the aftermath, and the accord mentioned previously, after which the Fed regained control of monetary policy. Recent scholarship by our conveners and others, I think, portrays monetary policy in the 1950s in a favorable light. More pertinent for this discussion, it portrays monetary policy in the 1950s as focusing on inflation and, to a lesser extent, temporary deviations from full employment. There's little emphasis. Revealingly, there's little mention in the minutes of the FOMC of the dollar exchange rate, the U.S. balance of payments, or the impact of US monetary policy on the rest of the world. The pendulum begins to swing back then around 1960. 1960 was the year when US foreign monetary liabilities first exceeded US gold reserves. It was when investors worried that JFK, if elected president, might follow FDR and devalue the dollar to get the economy moving again. That expectation that he would devalue proved wrong, but I think the other worries did not. The question for me, though, is how much influence those other international worries had on the policy process. One way of focusing thought on that is to count mentions of balance of payments considerations in the minutes of the FOMC, now thankfully machine readable. And if you do that, you can see the hump in the graph. I don't know how visible it is from the back, is the first half of the 1960s, where there are growing references, slowly but surely growing references to the exchange rate, and rapidly increasing numbers of references to the balance of payments. Qualitative evidence, I draw on a study that Michael Bordo and I have done previously, points in the same direction, calibrating a Taylor rule using real-time data points in the same direction as well. It shows that policy was tighter in the first half of the 60s than would be expected on the basis of inflation and the output gap alone, contrary to the impression I think that was left by some elements of the previous discussion. And I interpret that tightness of policy in this period as the Fed responding to those balance of payments concerns. Interestingly, then, reference to this begins to decline in the second half of the 1960s. That's when responsibility for balance of payments considerations is more clearly assigned to the Treasury as opposed to the Fed. That's when a variety of capital control-like measures are imposed in the United States that begin to relax the external constraint. The 1970s then is, as we've heard, a decade of mixed signals. It's a decade of uncertainty about Fed policy. The Fed was unconstrained by the exchange rate, unconstrained by much else. In retrospect, monetary policy drifted, and that then changed dramatically when Congress amended the Federal Reserve Act to include the dual mandate, and then when Chairman Volcker made inflation control a priority. From 1983, policy begins to track the Taylor rule quite closely, perhaps not entirely surprisingly, given that's part of the data set on which the Taylor rule is estimated. But I think what's clear is that inaugurates the period when international variables matter almost only insofar as they were relevant to the future evolution of inflation and the output gap. So that's a slightly overstrong statement. I list some exceptions in the paper, but I think it is the relevant generalization. One can point to a combination of factors to explain why international considerations were less influential starting in the 1980s than they had been in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and the 1960s. After the collapse of Bretton Woods, there was no longer an exchange rate peg or a gold peg to defend or to focus on. The 1977 amendment gave the Fed a mandate to pursue price stability and full employment, but said nothing about the balance of payments or international financial stability. The U.S. Still was, or was under the impression that it still was large enough and closed enough that the Fed could afford to act to a first approximation like the central bank of a closed economy. The U.S. trade to GDP ratio was rising, but more slowly than in the subsequent quarter century. The explosive growth of capital flows, to which Carmen alluded earlier, was essentially yet to come. All of this permitted the Federal Reserve to formulate and implement monetary policy more or less like a closed economy central bank with a few exceptions. So by way of conclusion, I want to ask whether international considerations will play a more powerful role on Fed policy in the future, and how, if at all, the Federal Reserve should modify the formulation and conduct of policy to take them into account. When I think about this, I think about three likely trends that will work to heighten the impact of international variables on the U.S. economy. All of them are debatable and reminds me that I have no time to debate them with myself. First, I assume that the U.S. will continue to grow more open to international trade and financial transactions. Trends in technology and policy both point in that direction. Second, I assume that emerging and frontier markets will continue to grow more rapidly than mature economies like the U.S., so the U.S. will come to account for a progressively declining share of the global economy. That's the logic of convergence, if you will. Third, I assume that the dollar will lose its monopoly as funding currency for international banks and as all but exclusive vehicle and currency of denomination for international transactions. There's no fundamental reason why only the U.S. should have deep and liquid financial markets. The logic of convergence suggests that the U.S. alone will not be able to provide safe and liquid assets on the scale required by the global economy. It follows that even U.S. banks and firms will come to rely more on foreign currency funding and liquidity in the future than they have in the past. The implication of these assumptions is that shocks to the exchange rate and the balance of payments will have a larger impact on the U.S. economy, and that the implications will extend beyond those for inflation and the output gap. They will extend to the stability of the financial sector, among other things. There will be the related tendency for large capital flows, in addition to pushing up the exchange rate, to put unwelcome pressure on housing and other financial markets, as has been the case in the recent past. But the volume of those inflows and their impact on U.S. markets will arguably be even greater. So assume, as I do, that as a result of these changes, the impact of the exchange rate and capital flows on the U.S. economy becomes more important. Does it follow that the Fed will have to modify the formulation and conduct of policy in order to take them into account? I'm too much of an economist to answer anything other than yes and no. If excessive reliance on foreign currency funding causes exchange rate movements to potentially have destabilizing balance sheet effects, we know that the first best response is not to use monetary policy to prevent those movements, but to strengthen prudential supervision and regulation of banks and governance of corporations to prevent excessive exposure to this form of balance sheet risk. If capital inflows place worrisome upward pressure on housing and other asset markets, then the first best solution is to strengthen lending standards, raise margin requirements, otherwise address problems directly in housing and asset markets. Second best will be to address the capital inflows that are the proximate source of the problem by applying inflow taxes, tightening fiscal policy under certain circumstances. That makes monetary policy the third best response at most. If the issue is permanent damage to the traded goods sector from temporary exchange rate appreciation, then the first best response similarly is to eliminate the financial imperfections, forcing incumbent exporters to exit or to use tax and other policies to address their problems directly. So you will know that all I have really done here is to restate the lean versus clean debate. The question in that context was whether central banks should lean against asset bubbles or leave it to other agencies of government to address those problems using other instruments better suited to the task. It was whether, even with less than full confidence that other agencies of government were up to that task, central banks could afford to shun preemptive action and clean up after any resulting damage with only limited repercussions. It would be presumptuous to assert that recent events have decided that debate in favor of one view or the other, but I think there is no question that those events have shifted the balance. They suggest to many of us that central banks need to think harder about when they should take preemptive action, both because other agencies of government may not be doing their part and because cleaning up afterwards can be very costly. The implication being that precisely the same issues will arise with growing intensity over time in connection with movements in the exchange rate and capital flows. Thank you.